you have a teacher and a pastor combined, it becomes almost unstoppable. Thank you, Excellency. That was a voyage through how we got out of recession in record time. He said while other economies in the world were still struggling and grappling, Nigeria was already out of recession. And the formula is called the Economic Sustainability Plan. Thank you, Excellency, Mr. Vice President. The next presentation will come from man I described earlier as one of our exports to the world. You know, we have many. We have at the World Trade Organization, we have at the UN, and now we have at the Africa Development Bank. The president of that bank is no one else than Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, a former Minister of Agriculture in this country. He's going to speak to us on Nigeria's economic resurgence, learning from the African example. Dr. Adesina, please.
Your Excellency, President Muhammadu Buhari, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Your Excellency, Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, my dear brother, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, thank you for that tour de force of your presentation. The President of the Senate, Dr. Ahmed Lawan, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Right Honorable Gbajabiamila Amila, the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, my dear brother, Boss Mustafa, and thank you very much for everything you did to facilitate my trip here today. The Chief of Staff to His Excellency the President, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, Honorable Ministers, the Head of Service of the Federation, Dr. Yemi Esson. Many of you may not know, but we actually grew up together. We are almost in-laws, in case you want to know. Permanent secretaries, captains of the industry, members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mr. President, for inviting me to be a guest speaker on the theme, Nigeria's economic resurgence, learning from the African experience, at this year's midterm Ministerial Performance Review Retreat. As we meet today, the world continues to deal with the effects of global COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has caused so many deaths and upended global economic growth. Due to COVID-19, Nigeria's economic growth, as we just listened to, actually declined to minus 1.8% in 2020. This mirrors the pattern across Africa, as the continent posted a negative 2.1% growth rate in GDP, the worst in 2 decades. The African Development Bank responded rapidly in supporting African countries. We launched a $10 billion crisis response facility to support countries. We provided $289 million in budget support to Nigeria. And as I was listening to His Excellency the Vice President, I was just computing in my head that 358.8 naira to the dollar, that would be about roughly 104 billion naira, which would be about 31% of all the 334 billion that you said. So, Mr. President, we did provide very, very robust support. The GDP growth rate for the continent will recover to 3.4% this year. We project economic growth rate for Nigeria will rebound to 2.4% this year and reach 2.9% by 2022. But the recovery will depend on 2 critical issues: access to vaccines and tackling debt issues. Africa has only 2% of its population vaccinated, compared to 54% in the United States and 75% in Europe. So while the developed countries are receiving booster shots, African countries cannot get even basic shots. Nigeria must build quality healthcare systems that will protect its population today and well into the future. Nigeria must also build world-class local pharmaceutical industries, and I emphasize local, able to effectively tackle the production of therapeutic drugs and vaccines. Here is the lesson. Nigeria must revamp its local pharmaceutical industry and launch strategic investments for local vaccine manufacturing. Africa should not be begging for vaccines. Africa should be producing vaccines. The African Development Bank will invest $3 billion in support of local pharmaceutical industries in Africa, including in Nigeria. Your Excellencies, Nigeria must decisively tackle its debt challenges. The issue is not about debt to GDP ratio, as Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio at 35% is actually still moderate. The big issue is how to service the debt and what that means for resources for domestic investments needed to spur faster economic growth. The debt service to revenue ratio for Nigeria is high at 73%. Things will, of course, improve as oil prices recover, but the situation has revealed the vulnerability of Nigeria's economy. To have economic resurgence, we need to fix the structure of the economy and address some basic fundamentals. Nigeria's challenge is revenue concentration. As the oil sector accounts for roughly 75% of export revenue, and according to the statistics of the central bank, 50% of all government revenue. What is needed for sustained growth and economic resurgence is to remove the structural bottlenecks that limit the productivity and revenue earning potential of the huge non-oil sectors. Here is the lesson. Nigeria should significantly boost productivity and revenues from its non-oil sector with appropriate and synergistic fiscal and macroeconomic policies, especially flexible market-based exchange rates that will enhance international competitiveness. Your Excellencies, infrastructure is critical for unlocking the full potential of Nigeria's economy. Nigeria will need $15 billion a year for investment in infrastructure. Financial innovations should be prioritized, as governments alone cannot afford these huge financial costs. The private sector should be given more incentives to invest in infrastructure. The federal government's 15 trillion naira infrastructure fund is a brilliant idea. So is the initiative for tax credits for private sector investment in infrastructure. And I was sitting next to my brother Aliko Dangote over there, and Aliko, just to let you know that I went on one of those roads that you built, and it looked like M25 road built in the UK, so we should do more of those. To be sustainable and more efficient, public-private partnerships, or PPPs, should be accelerated to finance major infrastructure all across Nigeria. Nigeria's institutional investors, especially the pension funds, should invest in infrastructure. Governments can also implement infrastructure asset recycling models, where existing infrastructure assets on government books can be turned over to the private sector, freeing up financing for governments to invest in new infrastructure needs. Here is the lesson. Sustainable financing approaches such as PPPs and infrastructure asset recycling will allow Nigeria to attract significant private sector investment into infrastructure. Your Excellencies, This brings me to the issue of trade, investment, and competitiveness. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area presents a major opportunity for Nigeria. Consumer and business expenditures in Africa are projected to rise to $6.7 trillion by 2030. Significant support, therefore, should be directed towards boosting industrial manufacturing capacities. Nigeria should also move rapidly to the top of selected value chains, such as automobiles, computers and electronics, textiles and garments, and food manufacturing, transport, and logistics. Much, Your Excellencies, will depend on the ports of Nigeria. According to the sector operators, the cost of exporting 100 tons of cargo in Nigeria is $35,000, compared to just $4,000 in Ghana. Today, the leading ports of West Africa are in Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, and Benin Republic. All of these countries have modernized their port management systems, leaving Nigeria far behind. Nigeria can learn from Morocco's world-class Tangier Med port. The port is unique in that it is an industrial port complex, a platform that has over 1,100 companies. They collectively exported over 8 billion euros worth of goods in 2020. Companies located at the Tangier Med port have allowed Morocco to move up the global value chains, including automobiles, automotive parts, aeronautics, agriculture, and food manufacturing, textiles, and logistics. Annually, over 460,000 cars are manufactured in the zone of the sports. And more interesting is that the bulk of the human resources to do all of this are Moroccans. Mr. President, I took a walk myself at the Tangier Med port. I actually thought they were on vacation, as I did not see people, just machines, haulers, automated systems moving containers in what looked like a well-synchronized maze with incredible efficiency. There were no kilometers of trucks waiting to get to the port. Your Excellency, we should not be decongesting the ports in Nigeria. We should be transforming the ports. This must start with cleaning up administrative bottlenecks, most of which are unnecessary, with multiple government agencies at the ports, high transaction costs, or even plain extortion from illegal taxes, which do not go into the coffers of the government where the revenue is badly needed. Here is the lesson. Nigeria should rapidly modernize and transform its ports. Ports are not there for revenue generation. They are for facilitating business and exports and stimulating industrial manufacturing and competitiveness of local businesses and exports. Your Excellencies, you knew this was coming. Agriculture, I can't give a talk without talking of agriculture. We must boost food security, reduce the price of food, and ensure greater competitiveness of Nigeria's agricultural sector. When I was Minister of Agriculture, we deployed a highly innovative mobile phone system to reach farmers with subsidized farm inputs, a program called Growth Enhancement Scheme and the e-wallet system. To be clear, this was the first time in the world that such a system was deployed to reach farmers with subsidized farm inputs via mobile phones. And it worked. It brought in transparency. It brought in accountability. It brought in all the major commercial banks. More importantly, it delivered impressive results and led to massive food production. It reached 15 million farmers with high-quality seeds and fertilizers right in their villages. Nigeria's food production boomed and expanded by an additional 21 million metric tons. The rice revolution started then in Kebbi State and the Northwest as we deployed innovative high-quality seeds of Faro 44 and Faro 52 rice, which we introduced to Nigeria from the Africa Rice Center. I remember visiting Hadejia Valley Irrigation Project in Jigawa State. As women farmers told me, "Thank you, Minister. We get our seeds and fertilizers right here in our villages by our mobile phones," and they emphasized, the men cannot cheat us anymore. I was elated. Prices of food fell and productivity went up. The Growth Enhancement Scheme and the e-wallet system has now been adopted in Central Asia, in Togo, in Liberia, and several African countries. In Nigeria, where they were developed, they are no longer being implemented. Your Excellency, Mr. President, you will have people telling you it is a lack of rain that is leading to low food production. A little, maybe. That it is insecurity. Yes, maybe. To some extent. That it is middlemen. A little, maybe. But Your Excellency, Mr. President, the main reason is that farmers no longer have access to quality improved seeds and fertilizers and farm inputs at scale. Farmers across the country are asking for the federal government to restore, in their words, and I quote, the popular Growth Enhancement Support Scheme and the e-wallet system. The chairman of the All Farmers Association of Nigeria, AFAN, Alhaji Farouk Moody, said in March 2020, and I quote, "These initiatives, Growth Enhancement Support Scheme and the e-wallet system, should be restored by the federal government. They will boost farmers' production, create jobs, and increase internally generated revenue for the states." I would like to urge Your Excellency, Mr. President, please relaunch the Growth Enhancement Scheme and the e-wallet system. It will put millions of farmers at the heart of your drive for agriculture at scale. If it is done and run well, I can assure you that you will have even greater dramatic turnaround in national food production. Your Excellency, Mr. President, the African Development Bank has helped to finance the revolution of wheat in Sudan with heat-tolerant varieties by producing 65,000 metric tons of seed. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this, let me say that the largest airplane, the Airbus 380 aircraft, fully loaded with passengers, with its fuel and cargo, weighs 98.4 metric tons. So 65,000 tons of heat-tolerant wheat in Sudan is the equivalent of 660 Airbus 380 aircraft packed on a landing strip. The impact was dramatic. In just 2 seasons, we helped Sudan to cultivate these heat-tolerant varieties of wheat on 317,000 hectares, which produced 1.1 million tons of wheat. The Prime Minister of Sudan, who you know very well, Mr. President, Abdallah Hamdok, said with this intervention, the country moved from 25% self-sufficiency to 54% in just 2 seasons. Sudan expects to become a net exporter of wheat within 3 years. We also supported Ethiopia to cultivate heat-tolerant varieties on over 184,000 hectares. Interestingly, these same heat-tolerant wheat varieties were introduced to Nigeria when I was Minister of Agriculture, and we work hard to give them to farmers in the Lake Chad Basin. Your Excellency, Mr. President, you may wish to know that during the insecurity in the area, my staff at the time at the Federal Ministry of Agriculture, led by one Dr. Oluwashina Olabanji, the then executive director of the Lake Child Research Institute, and his team, they stayed in the fields. They protected the seeds being multiplied literally with their lives. They risked their lives on those fields. When insecurity became much more serious, they moved the varieties to Kadawa Valley in Kano. Dr. Olabanji, Your Excellency, Mr. President, it's my humble submission, will deserve a national award. I was on the farms in Kano with several Serikin nomas or farmer heads. They could not believe that wheat could be as tall as they were. These varieties yielded 5 tons per hectare compared to the average of 1.5 tons per hectare. That is an increase of 400%. Nigeria should take advantage of the work of the bank on this and scale up cultivation of heat-tolerant wheat varieties all across northern Nigeria. Your Excellency, Mr. President, it is time to also take bold policy measures to drive the structural transformation of agriculture with infrastructure and spatial economic policies. The key for this is the development of special agro-industrial processing zones, SAPZs, across the country. There will be zones enabled with infrastructure and logistics to support the private sector, food and agriculture companies, to locate close to the areas of production, to process and add value to food and agricultural commodities. They will change the rural economies from being zones of economic misery to zones of new economic prosperity. The African Development Bank and our partners have already mobilized $520 million towards this program. We are working very closely with the federal government, 7 state governments, the Federal Capital Territory, the Ministries of Finance, Agriculture, Trade, Industry and Investment, Water Resources, and the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority on the design of these special agro-industrial processing zones. They are expected to create at least 1.5 million jobs. Here is the lesson. Nigeria should establish special agro-industrial processing zones all across the country. The e-wallet system and the growth enhancement scheme to boost farmers' access to productivity-enhancing inputs at scale should be reinstated and enshrined in law. And I see the Speaker and also the President of the Senate here. Policy reversals should be avoided. I talked recently to the new Minister of Agriculture, Honorable President. He called me and he and I had almost an hour conversation. He told me when he came to see you, his weight was 76.5 kilograms. He said when he left your office, his weight was 210 kilograms. That you told him so much he had to do, he gained so much weight. I don't know if you are here, Honorable Minister of Agriculture. I hope what I'm saying is correct. I just want to tell you that you will have my maximum support. Your Excellencies, we must unleash the potential of the youth of Nigeria. Today, over 75% of the population is under the age of 35. More decisive actions are needed to turn this demographic asset into an economic dividend. A young, productive, youthful population with access to education, skills, social protection, affordable housing, and medical care will power Nigeria's economy now and well into the future. We must move away from the so-called youth empowerment programs. The youth do not need handouts. They need investments. I would therefore like to commend you, Mr. President, for your decision to establish the Youth Investment Fund. That is why also the African Development Bank is currently working with central banks and countries all across the continent to design and support the establishment of what we call Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. These will be new financial institutions run by young, professional, and highly competent financial experts and bankers to develop and deploy new financial products and services for businesses and ventures of young people. Several African countries have already indicated their readiness to establish youth entrepreneurship investment banks. Here is the lesson. Nigeria should make its youth the drivers of the new economy through the creation of youth entrepreneurship investment banks that puts new financial ecosystems around them to fully unleash their potential. This will take the Youth Investment Fund, which you have established, Mr. President. It will take it to scale. It will institutionalize it, and it will make it sustainable. Your Excellencies, one of the industries that will dominate the future is the Fintech industry. By 2030, 650 million Africans will have smartphones, and 50 million will have 5G phone networks. Digital payments, mobile money accounts, savings, credit, and money transfers will revolutionize businesses. Nigeria's Fintech is surging as one of the leaders in Africa today. Google recently announced plans to invest $1 billion in Africa. That tells you something. They see the demographic and mobile tech growth and how this will rapidly change the future of e-commerce, trade, health, and finance. Your Excellency, Mr. President, the African Development Bank will support the federal government's efforts, being led by His Excellency Vice President Osinbajo, on the digital Nigeria. The bank is preparing investment in digital and creative enterprises, which is called iDice, Your Excellency, Mr. Vice President, a program that is $600 million worth of investment to be co-financed with several partners. These will promote entrepreneurship and innovation in the digital technology and creative industries. Here is the lesson. Nigeria should take the fintech industry as a major driver of the economy and invest heavily in digital infrastructure. Your Excellencies, an economically resurgent Nigeria must be a more peaceful and secure Nigeria. Today, more than ever, several African countries are spending a significant share of their budgets on security, displacing resources needed for development. Increasingly as well, the investable space in many parts of Africa, including Nigeria, is shrinking due to insecurity and insurgencies. Yet, resources are not there to enable countries to cope with these rising challenges. We must therefore recognize the strong linkages between security, investment, growth, and development. And that is why the African Development Bank is working on developing security-indexed investment bonds to help countries and regional economic communities to mobilize resources to tackle these challenges. The security-indexed investment bonds will raise funds on the global capital markets to support countries to upgrade their security architecture, rebuild damaged infrastructure in conflict-affected areas, rebuild social infrastructure, and protect zones where there are strategic investments. Here is the lesson. Without security, there cannot be investment. Without investment, there cannot be growth. And without growth, there cannot be development. The African Development Bank stands fully ready to help Nigeria in the design and implementation of security-indexed investment bonds to raise more resources to tackle its security challenges. Your Excellencies, climate change will pose significant challenges to Nigeria's economic resurgence. Climate change has already decimated a whole area of the Lake Chad Basin. Mr. President, you spoke to me directly about this. Today, the vast area of the Lake Chad Basin, which used to provide livelihoods and resources for fisheries, livestock, and food production, is now littered with parched lands, dried up waterbeds, and scorched earth. Nigeria must decisively tackle climate change. The African Development Bank will be there to help. The bank has committed to mobilize $25 billion in climate finance by 2025 in support of African countries. Here is the lesson. Nigeria must prioritize climate adaptation and mitigation actions. It should prioritize the recharging of the Lake Chad Basin. It should drive for a just energy transition. And I want to thank you, Vice President Oshibajo, for the push that you're giving on this. I followed some of your conversations on that. That we should drive for a just energy transition, which includes natural gas, to protect the economy, assure energy for industrialization, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As I close, Your Excellency, Mr. President, you and Nigeria sent me on an assignment. When I was elected president of the African Development Bank in 2015, as the first ever Nigerian to be president of the bank since its establishment in 1964. You personally stood by me in my most challenging moments last year. I was subsequently re-elected as president of the African Development Bank with 100% of the votes of all 81 shareholder member countries, African and non-African. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm also grateful for the tremendous support of His Excellency the Vice President, of the Minister of Finance, my dear sister, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, my dear brother Geoffrey Onyema, the Chief of Staff to the President, Professor Gambari, and indeed all members of the Cabinet, of the National Assembly, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and of course, all Nigerians. I feel tremendously humbled by the support. I am proud of what we have accomplished at the African Development Bank since 2015. With your strong support and those of 81 shareholder member countries, African and non-African. The work of the bank has impacted on the lives of 335 million people. The African Development Bank received an increase in its general capital from $93 billion to $208 billion, the largest ever in its history. The bank has maintained its stellar AAA ratings by the major global credit agencies for 6 years in a row, thanks to your strong support as our shareholders, which also includes Nigeria. And Your Excellency, Mr. President, this year, Global Finance, the globally renowned U.S. financial magazine, rated the African Development Bank as the best multilateral financial institution in the world in 2021. That is the kind of Africa we want. Africa showing global excellence in the middle of a turbulent world, finding solutions and driving innovation and change at scale. We must work together, hand in hand, and rise above the tide of challenges. We must never be defined by the extent of our challenges. You are a very tall man, Your Excellency, Mr. President. So you can handle water in the swimming pool, stand in the deep end with your head and shoulders still above water. And now that I have said that, Mr. President, I must let you know that you are so tall that if you and I were going to be swimming in the pool, that would be considered unfair competition. Your Excellency, Mr. President, like a builder strains to put one block on the other and cements them together, you need to ensure that all the blocks are now the right blocks and that they all fit together to build the kind of structure you desire and that the nation deserves. We must be remembered by our ability as individuals and collectively to rise above challenges with sharp focus, relentless execution, fairness, equity, public accountability, and transparency. We must drive for a much better and economically stronger Nigeria, a resurgent Nigeria, the Nigeria we build, the Nigeria we love, our Nigeria. I know that Nigeria will shine. Together, let us make that happen. History must remember us for that. Thank you very much once again, my dear Mr. President, for this great honor. May God bless you, Mr. President, and may God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria.